Hello everybody, and finally, welcome to part 19 of the Star Wars Legends Chronological Review series. If you're completely new to this series, this might not actually be a bad place to start, as today we are going to begin a brand new stretch of comics, the Knights of the Old Republic series, which acts as a prelude to the 2003 video game, Knights of the Old Republic. This series was written by John Jackson Miller, whose other Star Wars work includes the Lost Tribe of the Sith short story collection, which I have reviewed some of already. I've also coincidentally just finished Kenobi and the audiobook for The Living Force, which are two other Star Wars books that Miller has done, and it seems that Miller really likes writing stories about Jedi characters being put out of their comfort zone and adapting to situations where their preconceived notions of how the galaxy works and kind of their moral frameworks are tested by unusual circumstances and unusual characters. So having just read some of his other work kind of gives me a good idea of the kind of stories that John Jackson Miller likes to tell and where this story might go. This Knights of the Old Republic comic series has been collected in 3 Dark Horse omnibuses, a 2021 Marvel Legends omnibus, as well as 3 Marvel Epic collections. Those classic omnibuses, as well as the Marvel one, are pretty expensive as they're all out of print, so while I wait for a reprint of the Marvel one, I'm going to be reading this series in the classic trade paperbacks, so thank you to my friend Elena for letting me borrow these. So this series picks up 22 years after the death of Yelik Keldroma in the aftermath of the Great Sith War. So if you've read all of the Tales of the Jedi comics, you've basically got all the context that you really need to understand where these comics are picking up from. However, I'd say that as long as you've seen like the original and the prequel trilogies, you probably have enough context of how the Star Wars universe works to just be able to jump right in. However, the one thing I would really recommend is getting at least a little bit familiar with the Knights of the Old Republic game first. I know I really never suggest any prior reading for this series, as the whole point is for me to look at everything with like a fresh eye, chronological order, even if that isn't the optimal way to go about it. But for this, I would recommend playing a little bit of the game first, at least for like an hour or two, for a couple of reasons. The first reason is the game is just really good and really fun. It's one of the absolute biggest cornerstones. It's one of the biggest cornerstones of the sort of EU tapestry, second maybe only to the Thrawn trilogy in terms of wider impact in the fan base, as well as just the sheer amount of lore and precedent it puts down for the rest of the timeline and the elements it puts in that will be used by other pieces of media later. I recommend playing this game just because it's fun and it's just a good game set in the Star Wars universe, and I don't think that me or anyone else should really feel restricted to play it in or out of order, as it doesn't really require a lot of prior context to really enjoy. After all, the comics we're about to review were released after the game. The second reason is these comics act as a sort of direct prequel to the game and came out a few years after it. So a lot of the locations and characters included in this series will be better appreciated a little bit if you know how they're going to be implemented in the game. So having a very basic understanding of, say, the planet Taris, or characters like Darth Malak or Darth Revan or Bastil Shan, knowing all of that a little bit beforehand, I think will benefit you here if you're reading these comics for the first time. All that said, I really think that if you don't want to play the game before reading the comics or watching my videos covering them, you'll probably be totally fine. I've already played the game for 3 or 4 hours at this point. I still haven't left Taris, but I am enjoying the game so far, and I feel like I haven't been spoiled on any of the major story beats that I've already read in the comics. Other than like the one big spoiler for the game, which if you know, you know. I don't really know much about the game's plot, and I think that the comic follows its own pretty independent story that gives context to the game but isn't going to give anything else major away. I guess it just depends on whether or not you'd rather read the comics first to appreciate the game more, or play the game first in order to appreciate the comics more. But either way, it's all Star Wars. I'm sure you're going to have fun with it either way. At this point, I've rambled on long enough. Let's go ahead and jump straight into our first Knights of the Old Republic arc, titled Commencement. The first piece of media we're reviewing, actually, though, isn't a comic at all, but an in-universe article titled Taris Holofeed Prime Edition, which was included in a flipbook preview of edition number 0 for the Knights of the Old Republic series. This preview flipbook seems pretty impossible to find online, for a purchase, but there's a pretty great video by the YouTube user Revanchist who shows and both narrates this article like a real news show. It's pretty cool. There's some nice voice acting in it, and I'll link it in the description. So the first article in this Holofeed features an update on an ongoing war between the Mandalorians and the Republic, a conflict in which the Jedi's involvement has been controversial both in and outside of the Order. We don't get too much additional information on that, but needless to say, it looks like the Mandalorians have not forgotten their grudge against the Jedi after they fought them alongside the Sith 30 years ago. Other news featured here includes an indication that a hunt is ongoing for an individual named Zovius Mendu, as well as an advertisement seeking for investors for a fishing expedition in pursuit of some delicious fleek eels. The final article in the feed features a story concerning the swoop bite gangs that have infested the lower levels of Taris, and that to deal with the problem, the planet might turn to the Jedi and their 5 exemplary Padawans training at the planet's Jedi Temple. Overall, this is a pretty unique means of exposition for a Star Wars story told in a pretty grounded fashion that kind of puts you in the shoes of someone who's living on Taris or in the Star Wars galaxy. We get updates on some relevant galactic events, but also like some nice set dressing, like an advertisement for a fishing expedition that just makes the Star Wars universe feel a little more lived in and fun. I doubt that reading this will be essential for understanding the story of the comic, but it's just a nice primer for what's to come, especially acknowledging the backdrop of the ongoing Mandalorian conflict and the knowledge that a group of 5 promising young Padawans is going to be relevant to the story somehow. So finally, going into the comics, we actually get a brief 10-page issue 0 to truly start our story. We open on the bustling city planet of Taris, where we witness a deal being struck between the Snivian criminal Griff and a black market arms dealer. This arms dealer turns out to be a disguised Padawan named Zane Carrick. Zane is going to be our main protagonist for the series, and we get the sense that Zane has had an ongoing back and forth rivalry with Griff. Zane is a bit of a maverick young Jedi trying to prove himself by catching Griff, a small-time criminal, but apparently hasn't really been successful so far. As Zane says himself, his luck ranges from barely tolerable to cataclysmic. Like so, Zane gets his robe stuck in his speeder, which allows Griff to send the young Jedi plummeting into the city below. He's recovered though by another Jedi named Squint, who takes him back to the planet's Jedi Temple. On the way, the two have a debate about the Jedi's role in the ongoing Mandalorian conflict. Zane says that his master believes that the Jedi shouldn't be involved and should instead be vigilant for the return of the Sith, but Squint believes that the Mandalorians are the more relevant threat, as the Sith were pretty soundly defeated 30 years ago. We get the impression from Squint that the Jedi leadership aren't taking current matters very seriously and are still wrapped up in the Sith's non-existent shadow. Anyway, when they return to the temple, Squint joins the Jedi that are going to the war front, but not before telling Zane that he has a hunch, perhaps from the Force, that he might be a bigger player in the ongoing conflict than he realizes, saying that sometimes you have to enter the darkness to save the light, which Zane says doesn't sound like a very Jedi thought. Squint replies that it's not always a very Jedi galaxy. On the final page of issue 0, we witness an ominous conversation between 2 Jedi Masters, a Merulakan named Cornelia and a human named Lucian. Cornelia appears to have a vision saying that a line has been crossed and that they might have to change their plans to do something about it. Moving on to issue number 1, which begins our first true story arc titled Commencement, we witness another encounter between Zane and Griff, where Griff is trying to sell security droids to some thugs. We also get a quick mention of the Volkars and the Hidden Becks, 2 rival gangs that control the Taris underworld in the Knights of the Old Republic game. When Griff and his potential customers reach his warehouse, however, they find Zane already there with the droids in ruin. Zane gets Griff on the run once more, but after failing to properly execute a Jedi mind trick on him, Zane falls through the city's levels and crashes right into a Jedi banquet, which Zane had been expected to come to much earlier by his master Lucian. Zane meets up with his friends and they discuss the Jedi knighting ceremony that's supposed to take place that night. And though Zane feels like he makes too much of a fool of himself, he's confident that the other 4 Padawans will be knighted for sure. Masters Lucian and Cornelia watch the Padawans, discussing how they're glad to have had the dinner, as a sad change is coming soon and she will miss them all, even Zane. Lucian, though, coolly assures her that the Force takes them wherever it leads. Zane is told by his master to pay for the damage for the venue and to not be late to the ceremony that night. Later though, while working out the damage charge with the venue's owner, Zane senses Griff's presence outside and jumps out the window without paying. After a scuffle in which Zane loses all his money, Zane restrains Griff with the Force, finally catching him for good, and Zane takes his captive with him straight to the temple lest he be late for the knighting ceremony. Zane rushes into the temple, desperately hoping he isn't late. He enters the chambers and is ready to beg for forgiveness. He steps in, though, to see his 4 friends laying dead at the feet of their masters who have their lightsabers drawn. Master Lucian tells Zane he's late, and Zane makes a run for it. Starting issue 2, we get a vision of the past at a Jedi temple on Dantooine, where Zane's mother and a master of Yoda species named Vandar discuss a young Zane potentially becoming a Jedi, despite only having marginal potential for the Force. Zane's mother asks if the Jedi Order is safe, as she's worried about the Sith, but Vandar assures her that her son could not be safer. As Vandar's past voice echoes that the Jedi are the youngling's teachers and protectors, Zane flees from his murderous masters in the present. He manages to escape in his speeder, with Griff still cuffed to the sidecar, and the Jedi pursue the two through the city. Zane and Griff manage to escape by falling down a garbage chute into the city's lower levels. When Zane finally fills him in on the situation, Griff suspects that maybe it was Zane that killed his Padawan friends, but Zane convinces him it wasn't by reminding Griff of his general incompetence with all things Jedi. The two discover via a hollow billboard that Zane is wanted for the murders, with Griff as his accomplice, and the entire city is now looking for them. The hologram also calls Zane armed and deranged, which Griff says sounds about right. Implicates Griff as Zane's small-time accomplice instead of a criminal mastermind. Now in this together, Griff leads Zane to hide in a bar full of Kadorsians, a species of alien who are effectively blind after a long day's shift in the mines. Zane and Griff ruminate on everything that's happened, and Zane wonders just why his masters would want all 5 of his group of Padawans dead. Zane feels that something is extremely off, considering the amount of hate and fear that must have gone into such an act, emotions that Jedi Masters really shouldn't be using. Griff agrees to help take Zane to every world that Zane and his friends were trained on in a mission to uncover why the Masters wanted to kill them all, starting with the Taris Undercity. Elsewhere on Taris, the Masters mysteriously discuss if Zane could be the one, with Lucian saying that he doesn't really think that Zane is, but they have to be sure. Later, the Masters can see through their prescience that Zane and Griff are preparing to move through the Undercity. Lucian ruminates that the more Zane runs, the more he proves the Masters' actions right. Going into issue 3, Zane has a flashback to a previous Jedi exercise where he and his friends were released into space in order to navigate an asteroid field. Master Lucian advises them not to give ground to their fear, which might be difficult anyway considering there isn't any ground in space, but anyway. In the present, Zane and Griff get stopped by a group of thugs from the Vulcar gang after sleeping in a cart rolled by a Nabooan Famba. They escape when Griff deceives the thugs by saying that there's spice sewn into the harness of the creature. Elsewhere in the Undercity, the Jedi Masters fight their way through hordes of creatures called rat ghouls, which is another KOTOR connection, as well as Gamorrean guards, in their search for Zane. Though they thought that they would be able to predict where Zane and Griff would go, destiny seems clouded, and they identify Griff as a potential shatter point for the unfolding events around them all. Zane and Griff make it to the lower city, which Griff describes as a place where they tore down high-rises to make room for something else, then forgot the something else. Griff is able to convince Zane to cut off his Padawan braid, despite Zane wanting to keep it as a reminder of his past and his friends. But Zane can grow new hair. He can't grow a new head, according to Griff at least. The two encounter an acquaintance of Griff's, a pale-skinned Arcanian woman named Jarael, who greets them by smacking Zane in the face with an electrostaff. After a scuffle, Jarael reveals that she hates the Jedi, which makes sense considering they've completely trashed her homeworld looking for Zane, and they haven't done much to help the lower city before that anyway. They then meet up with the real person they were supposed to meet, a senile old Arcanian man named Camper, who for some reason sounds exactly like Master Roshi from Dragon Ball in my head.
We do not learn martial arts to pick fights or to impress girls who will say, "Oh, Beefcake, you're so strong, I want you." Do you understand what I'm saying?
Suddenly, the Constable of Taris and the Jedi Masters arrive and spot Zane. Though Jarael and Camper would ordinarily not want to be within 12 parsecs of Zane and Griff, they don't exactly want to be captured themselves, so they allow them to escape with them aboard their ship, the Last Resort. Moving on to issue 4, the Last Resort has made it into space, but the old and heavily modified ship struggles to get its systems online as the Republic closes in. Despite their bickering, the crew manages to maneuver the ship into an asteroid field, which buys them some time. Jarael helps Camper recover from their hectic escape, and Griff leaves to get some shut-eye, so Zane uses this opportunity to use the ship's comm system to contact the Jedi Temple on Dantooine. Though his old master Vandar is sympathetic for Zane, he still believes that he's the one who killed the Padawans, fearing that the dark side has caused Zane to do something that he didn't even remember. Zane continues to assert his innocence, but Vandar offers for the Jedi Consulars to help cure Zane's supposedly diseased mind if he turns himself in. Before their conversation can get much farther though, Jarael knocks Zane out cold with her her electrostaff for sending the ship out into open space in order to make the call. Discussing his situation further with Griff, Zane remembers that all the masters stationed on Taris, except for his own master Lucian, were consulars, which is an unusual arrangement for a temple, and suspects that it could possibly be a clue to the mystery. Zane recalls that the last place the masters and the Padawans were all at together was Taris' rogue moon, where the Jedi had held their harrowing training exercise. The Padawans were ultimately tasked with navigating the moon's surface safely while blind, using only the Force to avoid the moon's constant meteor strikes. So the team decides to travel to the moon, and while investigating the surface, Zane explains to Jor-El that he suspects something happened to the masters while they were supervising this specific exercise, since it had taken Zane an entire half day to complete. Zane manages to find the remains of T-1LB, a loader droid that had accompanied the Jedi to the moon, in hopes that LB might hold important information. Just as Zane is able to deduce that LB was thrown off of the cliff, meaning that the Masters wanted him destroyed for some reason, the Masters come down to the moon's surface to confront them. Starting issue 5, Griff and Camper in the Last Resort come to the rescue, having conveniently reactivated the power for the shields and the hyperdrive. Though the weapons are also now functional, Zane refuses to allow them to shoot his master, wanting to prove as much as he can that he's not a killer. Camper gets LB functioning again, and they're able to view the droid's holographic memories of the Jedi's test. On the moon, the Jedi Masters had decided to have a meditation session, and when they did, they experienced horrific visions of a potential future where the Sith return and wipe out the Jedi and the Republic. In the visions, a figure wearing a red environmental suit, just like the Padawans, features prominently. Though they debate the exact nature of the vision, the Masters ultimately decide that the safest option is to kill all of the Padawans to ensure such a horrific future does not come to pass. After Zane and the crew finishes viewing the recording, LB wipes his own memory in shock, and the ship becomes caught in the tractor beam of a group of bounty hunters. Once the bounty hunters board though, Griff is able to talk his way out of it by giving up Zane. Though Griff still tries to help Zane and come up with a plan to escape before the bounty hunters drop him off on Taris, it's flimsy at best, and Griff admits that he sees Zane as a losing hand and needs to cut him loose. Zane understands though, and acknowledges that he couldn't have gotten that far without Griff, and gives himself up freely. Zane does manage to escape the bounty hunters that night though, and moves to escape alone in the last resort. His goal is to forget his ways as a Jedi and disappear, as even he is now afraid that the prophecy about him is true. He's confronted by Jor-El, who is furious with him, arguing that by stealing their ship and leaving her and Camper in the hands of the bounty hunters or the Republic, he'd only be endangering others to save himself, and if that's the way he wants to go about things, then his skills aren't the only thing keeping him from being a Jedi. Moved by Jor-El's words, Zane surrenders his lightsaber to her, now determined to turn himself into the Jedi to stop the prophecy from happening and to keep himself from harming anyone else. Going into issue 6, we get a very dramatic Holo News recap of just how shitty Taris and the war against the Mandalorians have gotten lately, while Zane surrenders himself to the Jedi at the temple. Master Lucian thankfully does not try to gaslight Zane into thinking that he really did kill his friends, and reveals that Zane wasn't the only late arrival to the ceremony. We see another flashback, this time of the Padawans right before the ceremony is supposed to begin. They're excited when they learn that Zane will also be attending, but pretty quickly they don't come to believe that he will actually be knighted due to the way that the Masters have always been very doubtful that he wasn't cut out for the whole Jedi thing. Once Zane's friend Shad begins to really suspect something, the Masters draw their lightsabers. In fact, the whole reason Zane survived is because they were forced to act as soon as Shad got wise to their intentions. And man, if Zane's self-esteem hasn't already been completely shot, it has to be now. I don't know how you live with the fact that all your friends died without you because they didn't think you were good enough to be a Jedi. In the present, the Masters, claiming themselves to be a part of a sacred Jedi covenant determined to stop the Sith, defend their actions, claiming that Exar Kun was also once a Padawan, and his master failed to act, which caused the Sith War. Lucian kills the bounty hunter that brought Zane in, suspecting that Zane's allies are still on their ship and are determined to deal with them too, as they know far too much. Just before Lucian strikes down Zane, the temple shudders, the lights turn off, and a figure dressed in a red atmospheric suit crashes into the temple, swinging a yellow lightsaber. The Masters believe this to be the Sith Lord that was prophesied in their vision, as they're wearing the same red spacesuit, but it turns out to be Jor-El, and she escapes with Zane, which has got to be some of the craziest dramatic irony I've ever seen in anything Star Wars. Lucian admits that he underestimated Zane, but he just takes that as evidence that Zane really is as dangerous as the vision foretold, still trying to find a way to be correct about the vision. Accepting Zane's escape, he implores his former apprentice to forget the Jedi ways and hide, telling him to fear what he could become. Zane refuses though, asserting that fear leads to the dark side. Aboard the Last Resort, Griff offers Zane a full-time position in his criminal schemes, dismissing the whole bad hand metaphor from earlier, saying that he never even looks at his cards anyway. Zane is honored to have finally found a place among people who are willing to take a chance on him, but asks that Griff stops calling him intern. Griff agrees and calls him henchman. 3 weeks later, Taris has completely succumbed to riots, with public faith in the Jedi at an all-time low, which honestly seems completely fair. Just before leaving after being recalled to Coruscant, the Masters receive a message from none other than Zane himself. Zane tells his former Masters that he's had a vision of his own, that one day, one of the Masters will confess and clear his name, and that he will hunt down each and every one of them until he gets the confession. Zane tells Lucian that if he does end up collapsing the Jedi Order, to remember one thing, that he was the one who started it. Okay, so as a start, that was pretty good. I have to say, I was not super excited about this comic for the first issue and a half or so. I thought this was gonna be some goofy story about a Padawan with a cool early 2000s protagonist name like Zane with a Y, and he's tracking down criminals and getting into overall child-friendly hijinks. But then I got to the end of issue 1 and I got to that panel and my jaw dropped while reading it. I didn't think this story was gonna go to that kind of place, at least not that quickly based on what I had seen up until that point. And just the tone that I thought it had established at the start, really, it caught me by surprise, where I was at the end of issue 1, I was okay, so this is what we're going to be doing. So beyond the sheer the shock of that kickstart moment though, I have to say that the story, as in the actual just sequence of events that happened, was okay. It really dragged a little bit in the middle, and it had a lot of great ideas and moments that really solidified for me towards the end. Some of the mystery aspects didn't really quite click for me. It felt like Zane just kind of remembered pieces of information that the audience didn't know in order to just keep the story going along. The droid that had the right memory files, or the fact that all the Jedi were consulars and that was important somehow. It feels like Zane knew all of this, but the audience didn't. I don't know if I'm just missing information from the games that would make me clued into all of this, but the actual mystery part, it felt like Zane is somewhat of an audience surrogate protagonist. Stuff is happening to him and he has to react to it, but then he also knows all this information that the audience doesn't, so it felt a little off. I wasn't really being tuned into the mystery and gathering the evidence for myself to figure out what was going on. The pacing was pretty nice. Just the way the panels were sized and organized all felt very natural, and allowed for the really good timing of certain jokes or conversational elements or action set pieces. Honestly, it's arranged almost like you're watching a movie. It's hard to explain, but the timing and the arrangement of certain panels was really clever. Each moment felt like it had the precise amount of time that it needed to breathe and be effective. One thing I have to say that this comic does do really well is the humor, especially between Griff and Zane. There's really a lot of quips, and there's a lot of clever just Jedi related jokes, especially at Zane's expense. From what I've read from John Jackson Miller, when he wants to, he's really good at adding in these little humorous elements, making light of serious conversations and subject matters when appropriate, especially when there's Jedi involved one way or another. As much as I do love the grandiose, melodramatic, over-the-top operatic approach to the characters and the plot and the dialogue in, say, Tales of the Jedi, I'm really happy for the change of pace here for a more grounded story with characters with more unique perspectives that aren't afraid to make a joke every once in a while. So overall, the way that I felt the plot and the writing was structured was a little bit flimsy to me at times, but overall the emotional and thematic beats were there and they were really strong, and I think that part they totally knocked out of the park. Zane finding a home among the other societal rejects who will eventually embrace him for his principles and his heart, even though the entire Jedi Order is against him and are being really bad at being Jedi. That was a really neat story. It's almost like a weird, dark reflection of Rey's journey from the sequel trilogy. Rey is abandoned by her family and harbors a lot of potential to be a Jedi, and she isn't immediately aware of that potential, and she eventually goes from being like a lonely scavenger, to basically living a life that's really fulfilling and really heroic, surrounded by people who love her for who she is. Zane, by comparison, however, has very little force potential and gets his life ruined by the Jedi who have lost their way, and then he finds peace among like the misfits and the bottom feeders of the galaxy. The path of revenge that Zane claims to choose at the end is pretty dark, and I'm a little bit surprised given that Zane's intentions near the end, before he gives himself up, are ultimately pretty noble. I mean, it makes sense that his masters, just everything that they just put him through, they haven't exactly given him the best example of what it means to be a Jedi, but it feels like Zane knows to set that example for himself. I'm very interested to see how Zane's story is going to continue from here, and if and how he's going to fulfill that promise of hunting down each and every one of his Jedi masters. Like, I wonder if like the light and dark parts of him will clash and he'll feel conflicted about some of the things he has to do. I don't know how much this main quest of taking down the Jedi is going to factor into the whole story, if there's just going to be other side plots. It's only the first arc, so maybe I just don't need to think about it that hard. Part of me wonders if The Acolyte, which is currently coming out as I'm writing the script and recording, like consciously took any really major inspiration with the story of May from that show and how Zane in this comic. I wonder if there's any parallels there with May's motivations and backstory in The Acolyte, at least at the beginning of the show, how we think The Acolyte goes for the first couple episodes. I wonder if there's any inspiration from what Zane says he's gonna do, because they both seem pretty similar in that specific regard. Considering Leslie Headland is so vocal about taking so many inspirations from the EU, especially the KOTOR games, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a little, at least subconscious connection there. I don't have too much to say about Jarael and Camper quite yet. It feels like they're being set up to be more important later. Like, we get a lot of seeds planted that Camper in his old age isn't doing too well, and Jarael is pretty good with an electro staff, which I guess makes her good with a lightsaber. Maybe we're gonna get to see her train with a lightsaber. Maybe we're gonna find out more about her and Camper's past, if they have any. I can't imagine that they'd be in, this is a really long comic series, so I'm fine with the fact that we didn't get too much payoff for them right now, but I hope that they have some interesting secrets to seed into more stories in the future, and I wonder if in some weird way they're going to be connected with the Jedi or the Mandalorian Wars, either in the past or the future. But Jarael does have this great little moment with Zane where she rescues him and gets to return the favor of doing something selfless even at the risk of losing your freedom or your current way of life. Well, meanwhile, she didn't want anything to do with Zane at the beginning, but, Zane had given her the kindness of not stealing their ship, and then that kindness came back to him in return. And that's a really good kind of Star Wars-y moral that manifested itself here in a really nice way. Perhaps my favorite thing about this story, though, especially relating to kind of being in the context of Star Wars as a whole, is how much it deals with Force visions, falling to the dark side, and self-fulfilling prophecies, specifically relating to how such things are characterized in, say, Revenge of the Sith and The Last Jedi, which I know maybe some like big EU fans might be sick of me talking about The Last Jedi so much, but I really like The Last Jedi, so suck it up a little bit. The Masters in this arc fumbled being a good Jedi in two really big ways. They let what they feared might happen in the future do really great harm to people that they were around in the present, and they misinterpreted like how much a Jedi should control their emotions, and they misinterpret that to mean like a complete lack of compassion. It's like Qui-Gon says, you have to be mindful of the future, but not at the expense of the moment. If the solution to maybe stopping the Sith in the future is killing a bunch of children in the present, it's like you're not really any better than the Sith at that point, because that's the whole point of the Sith, is that they're willing to do evil things to get to where they want. That's the entire, like, difference of the MO between the Jedi and the Sith. It doesn't matter what label you put on yourselves, you're using either the light side or the dark side based on selfishness or selflessness. That's what George Lucas said was, the difference between the two. It's like the whole killing baby Hitler dilemma, debating between utilitarianism, which says that like actions are justified depending on the total net benefit for all people, or deontology, which concerns like whether the action itself is actually moral or not. In this case, the Jedi Masters ended up going with like what they thought was the utilitarian route. Even if their interpretation of the vision wasn't really based on truth at all, they just seemed really okay from the start killing a lot of people and deceiving even more people just to keep their actions under wraps and keep going the way that they thought was right. They thought they were protecting the light, but, you know, darkness only breeds more darkness. You can't just say, oh, I'm gonna kill a few kids. It doesn't work like that in Star Wars or real life, I don't think. This also serves as a pretty interesting parallel to the Jedi in the prequels, who, in a less extreme way, I think, end up sacrificing their morals and principles to fight Dooku and the Separatists with an army, although to not quite the same, like, direct homicidal extremes that these Jedi in the Old Republic were apparently willing to do. Even if the Padawans had the potential to turn evil, you know, they hadn't yet, and I feel like this story is very consistent with the idea in Star Wars that everyone has a choice to do good or evil, and even after you've done anything evil, you still have a choice to do good. And when Jedi Master characters get that wrong sometimes, it always has really disastrous consequences, even if you didn't actually end up killing any of your students, even if you just thought about it. So yeah, self-fulfilling dark prophecies usually, for me at least, makes for a pretty good, interesting story in Star Wars, and to use it for the origin story of like a young maverick Jedi character is super cool, and this only makes me more excited to see where Zane's story is going to go. One other little like world building detail that was also present in Tales of the Jedi, as well as some High Republic stories from the new canon, is that Jedi are spread throughout the galaxy at this point and have like temples on planets such as Taris and Dantooine, and they're training Jedi students for their whole lives on planets other than Coruscant. And I think that's always a really neat recipe for showing how Jedi are thought of and can influence the individual people of different worlds and backgrounds. Like how the Jedi's actions, I feel, has a more direct influence on how people actually think about them because they're out with these people day to day. So I guess finally to say, the art and the physical action in this story was very well done, like I said earlier, with the way that like the comic panels were arranged. It took me a little bit of time to get used to how the penciler, Brian Ching, decided to draw the humanoid characters, just the way that they looked and the way that the faces were drawn. Not my favorite style I've seen per se. I can't really put my finger on why exactly. Not to say it's bad by any means, but I've seen a much worse comic Star Wars art out there. And really some of the expressions of the characters were really effective and really haunting even at times. The shading is great, all the colors are very vibrant and clear. Taris definitely feels like a real shithole in like 8 different ways, and I think that the drawings and the vibrant colors do a really good job of conveying that and still making it a very fun, vibrant story in a very dynamic and interesting era of the galaxy. So yeah, I think that the colorist did a really good job. Big action set pieces are actually surprisingly rare in this story, but when they do happen, there's just really smart use of blocking and composition and panel arrangement. It's like I said, it feels like watching a movie sometimes. Everything kind of fits together great in terms of the art. Okay, so in conclusion, this was a super solid, pretty dark, but also really fun and really funny origin story for our main character, Zane Carrick here. Sets up some super compelling stories I think we'll see in the future, and is also quite impactful in its own right, coming full circle. And even if the mechanics of how the story operated were a little bit shaky for me in a few places, and some of the character dynamics aren't fully solidified or fleshed out quite yet, I'm going to give Knights of the Old Republic Commencement 4 dead Padawans out of 5. Anyway, next time we're just diving straight into the next volume, which is titled Flashpoint. It contains 6 more issues. It looks like we're going to confront some Mandalorians soon, which if that's not enough to get you at least a little more excited, I don't know what will. As always, just thanks for watching, and until next time, may the Force be with you, always.